Good afternoon and welcome to The Upside. I'm Jonathan Oliski with JMOR, and this is our virtual show brought to you by the Associated Jewish Federation of Baltimore and JMOR Magazine to keep Jewish Baltimore informed during this time of uncertainty. Now, if you have questions for our guests today, please be sure to type them in the chat or message us on JMOR's Facebook page. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce your co-hosts for The Upside today. Beth Goldsmith, Chair of the Associated Jewish Federation of Baltimore, and Dr. Scott Rifkin, publisher of JMOR. Beth and Scott, take it away.
Thanks, Jonathan, and welcome everyone. Last year, we celebrated the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, a time when the world said, never again. Yet, unfortunately, we are now seeing a disturbing uptick in anti-Semitism throughout the globe. Neo-Nazis are gaining currency. Holocaust deniers are distorting the truth and rewriting history. We've come to a crossroads in our country, and we must work very hard to combat what is going on. Fortunately, organizations like the Anti-Defamation League, ADL, and the Associated Baltimore Jewish Council, BJC, are committed to this task through education, advocacy, and more. Scott, please introduce our guest.
Thank you, Beth. We're excited today to welcome Doron Ezickson, and I hope I pronounced your last name right, Doron, and your first name right for that matter. I hope I did well with that. He's Vice President of the ADL's Mid-Atlantic and Midwest Division, and Howard Libit, Executive Director of the Associated Baltimore Jewish Council. Let me start with a couple comments. It seems that in the United States, we can talk internationally as well, but in the United States over the last 4 years or so, there's been an empowering of groups with anti-Semitic beliefs. And you saw it in the attack on the Capitol where folks were wearing Nazi paraphernalia. And you see it in the politician out on the, who's claiming that lasers from a Jewish billionaire are causing forest fires or something crazy like that. There seems to be an empowering and an unholy alliance between some of the right wing in this country and anti-Semitic groups. And I'd love to hear your thoughts, both of you gentlemen, on where we are in this country and where we are nationally on anti-Semitism and how it plays into the current politics. Doron, if you want to start, maybe.
Thank you, Scott and Beth, and it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for everybody who's tuning in. It's, I think, very important to understand what we are seeing today, in part in historical context. And we at the ADL start with an understanding of what is anti-Semitism. And at its core, anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory. It is animated by conspiracy theories. And when we see historically periods of time where there is social discord or economic uncertainty or political upheaval, unfortunately, people are given in a variety of cultures and over the millennia or religious contexts, conspiracy theories emerge, and the most ancient and persistent of conspiracy theories is of those of Jewish power, Jewish control, and the like. And so we have seen, yes, we have seen an unleashing, if you will, an amplification of what we refer to as mostly the seven tropes about Jews. And we have seen that absolutely on the far right and quite violently so, but not exclusively so. So it's important that we understand that in elements of the far left, we have seen also similar types of conspiracy theories espoused. We have seen it always in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as well as in certain so-called religious leaders like Nation of Islam and Louis Farrakhan, who has a virulent form of anti-Semitism and misogyny and anti-white attitudes. By far the most violent and the most deadly, however, has been on the far right. And the new tool that we have not yet come to grips with is social media and the internet, which is a platform that allows all of this traditional hate and the conspirators themselves to find one another, to educate one another, and to plan. And we saw that in high relief on Capitol Hill, as you referenced, Scott. And quite frankly, I speak of this in terms of bookends to this particular chapter, from Charlottesville to Capitol Hill. We saw the same in Charlottesville, also with deadly results. Howard, perhaps you'd like to add to that?
We don't hear Howard.
Yeah, well, Howard's on mute, so I'm not sure if he can control that, or John, if you need to get involved.
Sorry, I didn't mean to toss it to him if that wasn't the plan.
No.
It definitely
Sorry, I was
is the plan.
my apologies. I had a little coughing fit and I muted myself to not step over you with my coughing, and I couldn't unmute. But anyway, everything Doron says is of course spot on. I guess I tend to think of it here in the Baltimore area and Maryland as kind of, we have the anti-Semitism we may see in people's communications, that we may see in conversations, in everyday, everything from graffiti, the kind of to what you hear or what you see in conversations, to then the real concerns about safety and the real concerns about the most extreme forms, which fortunately here we haven't experienced directly in the Baltimore community. The violence that we may have seen in Pittsburgh or in San Diego or New Jersey, or even the attacks we've seen in some of the Orthodox communities of New York, which is all driven by anti-Semitism. And we've been lucky so far, but that doesn't mean we're not investing in the safety and security. It's really important, but also the education piece. And I know we'll get into that more, but really I guess the Baltimore Jewish Council was founded in response to the rising anti-Semitism in the 1930s. And 6-7 years ago, before I started with you with the BJC, as they thought about goals and priorities, at that time, it felt like anti-Semitism, while certainly wasn't totally gone, anti-Semitism wasn't the driving concern it was today. And as the board then thought about staffing, thought about resources, anti-Semitism didn't have its own position or its own person just because it didn't feel like we were in that moment. Now, in the last 2-3 years, we really feel like we're in that moment, and we really need to devote more time and thought and resources. And we're lucky we have national partners like ADL to help call on, to help us.
And if I might, Scott, just add one other thing also for context. And we at ADL believe in data and in trends, and really following things, and being able to speak objectively about what we are experiencing, maybe on a more ad hoc basis. And there's an underlying positive trend in some respects about Jewish life in America. We have polled routinely attitudes about Jews, and attitudes have improved. And in fact, in our most recent national poll, 69% of respondents, US adults, responded that they felt warmly towards Jews, that there was no animus, there was none, and only 7% would acknowledge some hostility, which is much improved over many years. That said, fully 40% of the respondents did believe multiple anti-Semitic statements to be true, and 11% believed 6 or more of these stereotypes, which are again rooted in those tropes I referenced: Jewish power, Jewish money, Jewish influence, dual loyalty or disloyalty, first loyalty to Jews, first loyalty to Israel as opposed to where they live. And so in order to understand the antidote, I think we have to understand the ill. And the ill has always been there. It's just been, and now we're in this spasm, if you will, as amplified by the internet, as I said. And I think Howard mentioned, and we are very focused, and in partnership with BJC, on education. I mean, you would think that the Holocaust would have stood still today as the symbol and the reason and the undeniable basis to confront anti-Semitism. And yet, in a poll that we just did in January, we found that 40% of American adults that are, in terms of their online activity, confront Holocaust denialism online. We're looking at the gaming space, where a lot of young people spend an inordinate amount of time. You can tell I have young adult kids. But fully 10% of gamers saw Holocaust denialism in the gaming context, in the online gaming context. So, that's another one of the strands, if you will, of anti-Semitism, but it's emblematic of the work that we have to do to push back, to eliminate the existence of anti-Semitism and Holocaust denialism in those spaces, and then to counter that with affirmative education.
So
I want to jump in for a second, Doron. You just zipped through several of them, but when you began, you talked about the 7 tropes. And I think it would help our audience to know exactly what those actually are, those 7. So what are the most common tropes and memes being used against us? If you guys mute yourselves, you cannot unmute yourselves. That's
Jonathan,
under John's control. So John, we need to unmute. We need to unmute Doron again. So please don't mute yourselves when you're not speaking. That's the way our system works. Someone else controls the muting. So when it says unmute, you can, but there you go. Sorry, Doron, go ahead.
All right, so Howard and I are even now. So the 7 tropes, that of Jewish power. So these are the international conspiracies, the notion that we control, there's a cabal, it's the protocols of the elders of Zion, right? That there's a secret society of power and international governmental control. It is of Jewish greed, that the motivation of Jewish action, the Jewish community action, is really rooted in money. It is still the deicide, that Jews are responsible for killing Christ, and that we are unholy, we are cursed by the devil, and that still, believe it or not, is pervasive, notwithstanding at least the Catholic Church's quite affirmative renunciation of that. It is the disgusting trope of Jewish violence against young children, and the idea of the Passover blood and for use in the matzah, which you see in much rhetoric in the context of Israel's actions against the Palestinians, but you also see it domestically here in the United States in something that's right down the street for me, which was Pizzagate, and the notion that there is this pedophile ring with a Jewish component to it hidden at this little pizza restaurant. By the way, the individual who arrived there with a gun and shot into the air to try to free the children, you'll recall that about 18 months ago, was freed just today from prison. And the conspiracy that he touted, which was QAnon, and that is the core of the QAnon conspiracy, is of a secret cabal of child abusers with a Jewish element to it. It is Holocaust denialism, which is really a more current manifestation, obviously, but that there is a big lie. And it is also about Israel, anti-Zionism, or Zionism as really being the assertion of Jewish power in an unjust way over masses of people and Jewish violence, and that the Jews are responsible here in the United States for advocating for war in aid of Israel, and so those are the core tropes, and underlying those are a series of statements about Jews that we test in these about Jewish loyalty, and who Jews really only care about themselves. They don't really belong to the communities in which they live. They think they're better than everyone. They're greedy, they're powerful, they control Hollywood, they control the media, they control big business. They started the COVID virus so that they could come up with a vaccine and profit from it, which has been a very strong current that we've seen recently.
So let me ask a question. it's easy for me as an unrepentant liberal like I am to blame the former president and say, he really empowered these groups. And I can certainly give examples as anybody can. But is it really just the case of a politician riding a wave that they recognized? Or did the politicians really trigger this resurgence? What do you think?
I'll hasten. I don't know if, look, I want to say, first of all, that ADL is not a bipartisan organization. We are a nonpartisan organization, right? We do not take positions in partisan politics, but we speak truth to power. And we have been very clear that President Trump took advantage of old hate and rising fear and utilized it in what we thought was an extremely irresponsible and ultimately deadly way. And so now that does not mean that the president or even the president's core advisors created this. As I said, this is something that's always existed. It's been animated and unleashed at different times in our history. If you talk to our Black brothers and sisters, African Americans, they feel this every day in one way or another. But there's no question that it was mobilized and given permission, or at least subtly, maybe not so subtly, amplified. And that is a huge problem. But if it were only about the president, when the president's gone, so would the problem be gone. And that is absolutely not the case.
So let's move forward with that. I'm using the analogy of a genie in a bottle. So the genie's been released from the bottle, if you will. How do we put it back in? I know this is the work that you do, both our Jewish Council and at ADL. How do we get that, take back some control and put some of that hate away?
I'll jump in a little bit. I mean, I think it's definitely challenging, but I think Doron mentioned a couple minutes ago, education. I mean, at the heart of it, I think putting the genie back in the bottle, if you can. I don't know that we can put the genie back in the bottle, but we can try and educate those who are persuadable. I mean, there are some who maybe are beyond where we can reach. But there's some people who are swept up in this, who if we engage with them, if we educate, if we, teach at an early age about the Holocaust, if we correct misimpressions when we hear them, if we're willing to speak up, I think we can make a difference. But I can't say that everyone is. I'm not sure that everyone can be brought back from over the edge of anti-Semitism.
Yeah, I would agree with Howard and add maybe a couple of other elements. Number one, I do think we have to go back and ensure that our own community is educated about the history of anti-Semitism, the construct, and educated in a way not to hold it up as a sword against others, although we certainly do that when necessary, but more to have a vehicle for conversation when sometimes folks inadvertently reflect and act.
Oh, we've lost Doron for a minute. Okay. In the absence of, can everybody hear me at this point? Beth, can you hear me? Good.
Yes. I think Doron froze.
Yeah, we lost Doron for a minute. There we go. Is he back? Nope, I guess not. Okay, so let's move on to another question, and then we'll come back to that when we get Doron back. I guess one of the questions I have is folks that are anti-Semitic and folks that have concerns about Israel in various political matters. And how do we separate the two groups? Because there are people that are going to hate everything Israel does because they hate Jews. But there are other people that have concerns with Israel's this or that policy, and they're not necessarily anti-Semitic. So how do you address that?
I think you raise a very, a real challenging part. I mean, legitimate criticism of Israel is fair, right? You can criticize the government of Israel. You can criticize actions of Israel, just like we criticize actions of the United States. And Israel, you go to Israel, Israelis are among the first in line to criticize actions of their government or things, and there's certainly the issue comes when that criticism becomes unfair in the sense of you're holding Israel to a standard where you wouldn't hold any other country, or you're using some of the tropes, classic anti-Semitic tropes, to describe Israel's actions. You hear occasionally people make the comparison to how Israel handles issues on the West Bank to concentration camps or to the Nazis, or that it's an apartheid regime, all of which is totally unfair and crosses the line into anti-Semitism. But if you hear people say, look, I don't agree with how Israel is handling issues on the West Bank, and your criticism is fair and is rooted in facts, that doesn't become anti-Semitism. And I think you need to be clear. You need to call it out when people cross the line, and engage in it. But you also need to not call people anti-Semitic just necessarily just because they are disagreeing with the policies of Israel. It's among the more complicated issues of anti-Semitism, and I get it, but I think there's a line you can draw and distinctions you can make.
Howard,
Yeah.
I have a question here from an audience member, which is wonderful. And just to remind everyone, type your questions into the Zoom chat. We simulcast on the Associated and Jay Moore's Facebook pages. So we have thousands of people watching today live in the coming days. Great question here from Joyce, Howard. And she asks, what about the thesis of Dennis Prager's book, that people hate us mostly because of our Jewish values, our conscience, our morality, our ethics? What's your perspective on that?
So I'll admit I'm not as familiar with the thesis there, so I'm not necessarily particularly qualified to speak to it. I mean, clearly there are Jewish values and Jewish our successes or whatever else you want to describe it, that attracts anti-Semitism. So I mean, I think the Jewish community, for whatever people are looking for a scapegoat in many instances, and I think that the Jewish community unfortunately becomes the target historically and currently.
Yeah, I mean, there's
I
certainly.
see Doron, Scott, I see Doron is back. So can we, and he's able to, he's not frozen. So maybe we can get him involved back into the conversation.
What was the question we left Doron with? And I apologize, I forgot.
Well, he'll remember what he was talking about, but now we're talking about, in response to an audience question about Dennis Prager's theory or postulate, whatever. So Doron, you can chime in with any of it.
I think, well, just to finish the prior thought, and I apologize, we had a power outage here, so it took me a minute to get back. And I'm not in Texas. But I think the understanding by the community and our obligation to educate the generations and our children about the history of anti-Semitism is something that unfortunately we can't afford to ignore, notwithstanding our relative good position in this country. It's something that we bear the burden of. And we at ADL believe that extends beyond just anti-Semitism in the Jewish community. We were founded back in 108 years ago, following the lynching of a Jewish businessman in Georgia, with a dual purpose. Clearly the priority to stop what was then called the defaming of the Jewish people in the United States, but also to secure justice and fair treatment to all. That's based in Hillel's teaching in Pirkei Avot that, if we're not for ourselves, who will be for us? Or if I'm not for myself, if I'm not for others, who am I? There's a moral standard, right? And if not now, when? This notion of action. So what's critical to understand here is that we must be subject matter experts on our own histories, and we must teach our children. But we also must remember that in a democracy, the power of this country is that in coalition, we are stronger. And we are uniquely in a position to understand, even if we didn't personally experience slavery or the Holocaust to understand the power of hate. And so if we can speak and also take upon ourselves an understanding of the journey and the challenges of other minorities in America and act in coalition, and in those coalitions also educate them about our experience, there is a unique opportunity to really help make democracy everything that it should be and could be. And I fear that our education institutions have kind of taken democracy for granted. They took our society for granted, and we need to get back to the basic levels of teaching our children about hate, about civil rights, about civil society, about our democracy, about civics, the way many of us were educated when we were young.
So where do we go from here? We clearly have an uptick in the amount of anti-Semitism. What's the big approach that we need to take at this point? Because if we keep doing what we're doing, we don't seem to be winning at this moment. We seem to be losing. I think they're locked up again, unfortunately.
So let me speak to a little bit. You know, we spent and I know you all. There was an upside that focused on the Baltimore Community Anti-Semitism Task Force a few shows ago. You know, so we have seen ourselves as focusing on 4 essential areas as we try and combat anti-Semitism. Education, as Doron talked about, both education of our community and education of other communities. Advocacy, advocating for additional laws and other efforts to fight hate crimes, to fight anti-Semitism. We've talked about allyship, you know, as Doron was just talking about, standing with others when they encounter hate, building deeper relationships and deeper partnerships across different communities. You know, it's why when for example, when the Muslim travel ban was put in, the Baltimore Jewish Council spoke up against it, and standing with others when incidents occur. You know, when the shooting happens at the synagogue in Pittsburgh, among the first people to call are leaders from other faith communities who want to check in with us and who show up the next day at a service we put on to stand with us. And kind of the 4th area is the tracking and reporting of incidents, so that, you know, we can't fight anti-Semitism and fight anti-Semitic incidents if we're not keeping track and aware of what's happening, so we know what to be looking out for, we know what to speak to, and that ranges from social media to graffiti, to the clerk in the grocery store making an anti-Semitic comment to a Jewish shopper, to the extreme violence that we've seen. And we're fortunate on that last element with the reporting and tracking, that on both the Associated's website and the BJC's website, we have created a means for people to report incidents that occur. It goes to the ADL because they already have an online system, and we're fortunate that we're sharing these reports across between the ADL and between our Baltimore community to say, do we need to respond? Do we need to report this to law enforcement? Does someone need a follow-up call to help understand how to deal with this anti-Semitic incident in their kid's school? Whatever it is, people need to be able to communicate it, need to have a way to get the expert resources, and that's what we're trying to provide.
Howard, so I have a Facebook question here from Claire about a local incident. Perhaps you and Doron are aware of it, but Claire writes, at Hopkins, a TA bragged about grading Jewish and Zionist students differently. She goes on to say hundreds of people in the community contacted Hopkins. She says nothing's been done. Clearly, she's a frustrated advocate. Could you comment about this particular instance if you're aware of it?
Sure. We've been working with Johns Hopkins administration about it. There were a number of students at the university who have filed complaints. There's a process that the university is following. They've been interviewing everybody, conducting an investigation. It takes a little bit of time, particularly in the pandemic, to get all the interviews with all the different students in that department who felt like they may have been discriminated against or may have been affected. My understanding is that a report's being written, and then it goes to the higher ups of the administration, who will then make a decision on what to do. I mean, as much as we might want Johns Hopkins, as soon as the social media posts were brought to their attention, as much as we might want the university to say, we're banning her from the university and throwing her out, she has due process too. There's a process they have to follow to go through this, because if they don't, it all gets reversed. And so we need to respect that, and be patient, but not let it stall. And so we're keeping up the quiet pressure and working with the university, because we also have to appreciate our relationship with the university. A couple weeks later, they had an incident of swastikas being found on the Peabody campus, and the university reached out to Hillel, reached out to us to talk to us about it. They made sure and talked to us about what their statements to the Hopkins community were going to say, and we offered some suggestions to make it more reassuring to the Hopkins students and to make it clear how seriously they were treating it, which they took. And so us being in dialogue and partnership with organizations like Johns Hopkins is really important for us to make a difference.
Thank you.
And I would jump in and sort of second that emotion, Howard. Thank you. That at least we are very happy to know that we have a process, that there is a process that's a very clear process from the Associated, working with our Baltimore, we like to proudly say it's our Baltimore Jewish Council, and that the process is working. And unfortunately, things, as you said, don't always happen as quickly as we might like, but we are very gratified to know that we have a process in place, and that process, the steps have been followed and things are proceeding. So I hope for all of our audience out there that they do understand that we do have a process in place and we are following it to the letter. And you will know when we know what the outcome is. Doron, so sorry we keep having issues.
I think it's on my end. I apologize. This hasn't
with your
happened before.
connection.
Yeah.
Jump in with whatever you want to say at this moment.
Yeah, I want to highlight, because I think it's really important for folks to know that the Hopkins situation, which we also coordinated with Howard and his team and the local Hillel on, represents, I think, a great example of the wonderful partnership that under Howard's leadership, we have been able to have with your local community. Look, in the world of sort of the competition among organizations, the different philosophies, et cetera, oftentimes we look at, how many the alphabet soup of organizations focused on issues. Our commitment at ADL is to work as closely as we possibly can with federations and with JCRCs around the country to partner with their knowledge of the community with our expertise about anti-Semitism and our expertise about how to embed in institutions sensitivity, education programs, and the like. And this is a great example of that partnership, as is the fact that you can report incidents for our anti-Semitic audit through the websites of the Associated and the JCRC. It doesn't sound like a lot, but it is actually a model for many, many other communities, and I recite it regularly. This is what we need. If we're going to fight off the amount of hate that exists out there, we need to figure out better ways and ways to maximize our limited resource by leveraging each other and working together. So I just want to thank the Associated and particularly Howard and the BJC for that ongoing cooperation, and we're fully committed to that partnership.
And beyond reporting, what else can people do if they are faced in their own lives with such incidents?
Well, we talk about sharing facts to the extent that it's safe to do so, or you're in an environment, and I referenced earlier being more knowledgeable about the roots of anti-Semitism, and we have materials for guided conversations on our website under what we call table talks. Oftentimes these are styled as conversations between parents and children, but they also apply to colleagues and to other family members or co-workers. But figuring out a way not a confrontational way, and never in the case where somebody might fear, for their safety, but try to engage in a knowledgeable way, understand where the person's attitude comes from. Secondly, it is to look around and to start insisting that our education institutions take the anti-bias, anti-Semitism work more seriously, that they actually commit to programs on an ongoing basis. We work very closely with Howard, through and the Holocaust Museum there on issues related to Holocaust education through our Echoes and Reflections program. Echoes and Reflections is a joint program of Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, the Shoah Foundation, and ADL, and we have free training and curriculum for teachers. Many schools in Baltimore have adopted trainings as we try to encourage Holocaust and genocide education. But we also have programs generically about creating what we call No Place for Hate. So we have a expanding school program for kids as young as kindergarten, first grade through high school that empowers them on a peer-to-peer basis to create a place and to commit to no hate in their halls, and creating a few activities, and we give them banners they hang alongside their athletic championships, and try to make the fact that people don't get bullied and we don't have hate in the halls of a school a point of pride. And that is one of our fastest growing programs. We'd love to see more schools, public and private, in the Baltimore area adopt it. There's no ideology behind it. We're not pushing the particular view other than let's have conversations in schools, let's have activities that celebrate diversity, let's empower kids to talk to their peers, which we know from a pedagogical perspective is the most effective way to change culture in schools. And then when it comes to universities, these ad hoc one-offs are no longer ad hoc, in fact, in terms of expressions of hate. And every university has to have an approach. And we're advocating for freshman orientation, that part of the codes of conduct and what it is to be a citizen in a university or college campus involves not engaging in certain types of activities. And we have a program called Hate Uncycled, which really is a guide for administrators and professors on how to embed in the university a response mechanism and an education mechanism. So again, lots of tools available. If you have connections, if you see something happening, you can be empowered. Obviously, we want our legislators to hear as well. We have a lot of legislation pending, state and federal. And today it's easy to register over the internet your support for something. And we work on state advocacy with Howard regularly in terms of state-based bills, and continuing to elevate this idea that hate crimes are a special category of crime. Lastly, it's a controversial area right now, but we firmly believe, and I know Howard does as well, that law enforcement has a role in protecting civil rights. And we commit an enormous amount of resource to doing the hard work of educating law enforcement about the history of hate, about how hate unchecked can result in the Holocaust. We have a program with the Holocaust Memorial. Baltimore County Police have participated, where we bring cadets to the Holocaust Museum and examine what happens in a putative democracy when local police become complicit with a hate group, and what can happen, and reminding folks. And so we train FBI agents, we train local police, county, state police on the importance of recognizing and investigating hate crimes, which is a different type of thing, and they don't get it in the academy. And so there's education to be done there. It's fraught right now because of the treatment by so many individual law enforcement members and sometimes leadership of the African-American community. We have to call that out and look for solutions as a priority. There's no question. And even so, we have to recognize that if law enforcement isn't educated about their role, we can't count on them to do the right thing.
So let me change the topic just a little bit. And it's about whether there's hope out there. And I look at the younger generation of folks, and they seem to be more accepting of people that aren't them. There seems to be more acceptance of racial diversity, of religious diversity. You do a lot of research, Doron. Are you seeing that? Do the younger generation seem to be coming around when it comes to the issues that surround hate?
Excellent question, Scott. It's a little bit of tale of two cities, and we will see. On the one hand, absolutely, particularly if you look at it, for example, in the context of LGBTQ rights. So the members of the community who are different in their sexual preference or sexual identity. There's a very different construct among young people for the most part than among older folks in terms of what we've experienced and what we've come to understand. And to understand the violation of rights. I think in the race space, there is much less patience among young people for the perpetuation of the violence and the discrimination that they perceive against people of color. And so there is hope there. Now, some of that can get a little extreme also, and can, ironically, particularly with regard to the very far left among young people, they associate Israel with a colonialist power, and anybody who supports Israel is, that doesn't have a place in the domestic civil rights agenda. And that's illogical. It's not rooted in history, but it's real. But the other side of it is, unfortunately, there are so many young people who have drawn to the extremism of the far right, that occupy these spaces online, the gaming spaces, et cetera. And whether they're looking for it or not, they see the hate content. It's part of the reason why we organized, along with NAACP and Urban League and Color of Change and other organizations this past summer, a request for corporate advertising. Stop advertising on Facebook for a month to send a message. And we had hoped for 100 or so companies to do so, and over 1,200 did. So, we're trying to mobilize and change the conversation about what is online, because what is online on the far right space is truly vile, and it's against all people of difference, if you will. And we've seen it activated into deadly violence. And unfortunately, we see it parroted among new members of Congress. We have down in North Carolina a 25-year-old young man who cites, without understanding, I believe, his trip to see the Hitler's bunker, and uses QAnon conspiracy theories to explain things. And this is rooted in on the far right, and it's going to take a lot of work to get it out, but work that attempts to be dialogue with those who are willing to engage in dialogue.
Yeah, it's scary the way that people believe these conspiracy theories as fact. That's scary stuff. And you mentioned the gentleman who just got out of jail, who was absolutely stunned and surprised when he marched into that place and found there was no basement full of pedophiles. In fact, the restaurant didn't have a basement. So it was really fascinating how much he just believed this craziness he was hearing online. So what else do we do? This has been a great conversation. You both are at the leadership of trying to address this problem. Do we ever get rid of it completely? Probably not. But what other great big steps do we need to take, or are we on the right path?
Well, I would say we're on a path. I think we're on the right path, but I think we as a Jewish community need to commit to making sure we educate ourselves, that we educate our children. For example, the Associated the Inside Israel Forum are launching later in March this effort to, with Open Door Media, this national effort to better educate 11th and 12th graders about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, preparing them for what they may experience on college campuses. So steps like that, as well as, here in Maryland, we've persuaded the state superintendent to make Holocaust education a more rigorous part of the curriculum at the elementary, middle, and high school level, and at the middle school level, to teach that at the roots of the anti-Semitism that was kind of at the roots of the Holocaust, so that kids begin to understand that. I mean, so there's steps in progress. We have to keep it up. We can't get complacent. When I talked earlier about 7-8 years ago, we didn't see anti-Semitism as a pressing priority of the Baltimore Jewish community, because it felt like we had moved past it in some ways. It wasn't out there in the extreme levels like it is now. If we move to a place 2 years from now where we're again feeling safe and secure, that probably doesn't mean we need to let up. We need to remain just as focused in different ways. We need to, I think we've learned that lesson that when there's economic uncertainty, as Doron mentioned, when there's other issues nationally, that the forces that push anti-Semitism can be unleashed almost overnight. And we need to stay vigilant for that.
Very good. And Doron, do you think, what else do we need to be doing?
It's probably not dramatic in a sense that people will go away with, wow, I really learned something, but it really is doing what people are doing today. It's being open to new information. It's being aware and prioritizing an understanding of these hate dynamics, and wanting to dig a little deeper, right? Get a little deeper understanding, commit to it, choose one institution that you would like to see change. Choose one person that you would like to engage with and have a conversation with whom you disagree, but who you think sometimes inadvertently or without knowledge, spills over into a form of hate. If what appeals to you is understanding the hate that others face, become more educated about what African American citizens face in this country every day, or Asian Americans more recently, in the COVID crisis, or Latino, Hispanic Americans and the immigration crisis, and the kind of isolation and fear that they live in every day. There are so many people living under a specter of hate or derision. Any person you reach out to help, any community that you indicate a willingness to understand their story will be appreciated. And if each of us does that little thing, we start to turn back the tide. Those pebbles create, all in the pond, create the wave that ultimately will turn this. And understand that we're not going to do it in a day. We're not going to do it in a year. This is generational, and this is something that we're going to have to see through. And hopefully, we will identify the young leaders who are already within our organizations or in our communities to take it forward after that. We have to tend to our democracy. We have to tend to our humanity. And it's very difficult to do so right now, but small steps matter.
And it sounds to me, and you've made a couple comments to this effect, that it's incumbent on us as Jews to confront our own flaws as well, to understand what an African American is feeling every day, or an Asian, or somebody who's gay. Because if we understand how they're being discriminated against, it allows us to form the partnerships that attack all this. Is that a fair statement?
Very much so. I mean, one of the things actually that we've been working on, not just the BJC, but the associated as a system, is also just looking in-house, at how the white Jewish community deals with and treats Jews of color, and the feelings that Jews of color have with, when a Jew of color walks through a synagogue, and the look of suspicion they have, well, why is that person here? Because when there are, roughly anywhere 10% or more of Jews are Jews of color, and we as a community that is predominantly white need to start there in terms of how we treat Jews of color, and then from there be thinking about how we're working with other communities as well. But we need to confront our own internal biases.
I appreciate you saying that, Howard. And I will say, even we at ADL, an organization that exists as an anti-bias organization, we have our own diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative. And we are re-looking at how we educate ourselves. We're re-looking at our priorities in this moment, because it's an evolving issue, and we can't take it for granted. And we think it strengthens our ability to serve and to create, again, the wonderful country that the great experiment we're still engaged in of our democracy is meant to provide us. We can't look away from the obligation to maintain, and looking inward is a big part of that. And then being activating. Remember the Hillel admonition: we take care of ourselves, we take care of others, and we act. That is guidance as relevant today as it was when it was spoken so long ago.
Very good. We just got a chat message asking about the far right politicians and what ADL does to try to oppose them. And you mentioned them briefly a moment ago, but is there a concerted effort in that regard?
We monitor at every level that we can where true extremists are seeking office or in office. Again, we cannot engage in campaign activity, but we can call things out when statements are made. We call them out. We will engage with people to educate them if that's appropriate or possible. But when not, we will call for action. So with the Congresswoman Marjorie Green Taylor down in Georgia, she was an unapologetically, unabashedly conspiracy theories, anti-Semitism, and anti-immigrant, many other isms. We finally, as we did with the previously with the Congressman King from Iowa, we wrote very strongly to the leadership in the House to strip her of her committee assignments, and not allow her to move forward in the committees. And that, in fact, was done. We weren't the only ones who called for it. But so, yes, we do monitor it. If you see it on a local basis, if you see it at the school board or the school committee, if you see it on the council, and it's of concern, it is important for people to know about it. I grew up in an era where sometimes, and for some of you may have experienced this, the reaction of my grandparents were shah, yeah, don't say anything, don't make a big deal, you only elevate it. We can't afford that anymore. We have to call it out, and we will always be there, and jointly with the BJC where appropriate. Sometimes it's easier for us to speak in those situations than more local organizations, but we will always speak out where appropriate. And sometimes it's a letter that doesn't see the light of day to engage in a conversation, and sometimes it's something more dramatic. And so please keep us informed if you see those kind of things.
And you mentioned democracy, and it's really interesting you mentioned that, and strengthening the democracy. And it strikes me that we often don't realize that it's not government that protects us. It's not politicians that protect us. It's the democracy itself making our votes important as a voting bloc, and therefore you get paid attention to. When you comment, you made the comment about strengthening democracy as a way to deal with anti-Semitism. Do you mind elaborating on that a bit?
Well, I think it's, number one, it's maintaining trust in government institutions. The institutions are intended to have fealty to our Constitution, and embedded in our Constitution is a Bill of Rights that's supposed to protect each of us, regardless of our religious beliefs or no beliefs, the color of our skin, our gender, our gender preference. And so, again, people assumed that each institution in the democracy kind of exists and is strong. But I think the last several months, have demonstrated that, that even our democracy can be disrupted, that there are ways in which our elections can be interfered with, where the rhetoric and the masses can attempt, literally in the Capitol insurrection, an attempt to stop the accounting of the electoral votes. I don't think any of us would have believed that was possible, although I will say that ADL was on record and had publicly and had communicated to law enforcement our concerns about that exact thing happening days before it actually did. So part of this is listening. But when I talk about our democracy, it's really about people being active, people engaging, people ensuring that the votes turn out, ensuring that people are called to account that move outside of that. If we take the system for granted, if we give over to others the power to choose who our leaders are within our democratic system, we do so at significant risk today. And so it's about engagement. It's about really understanding and putting pressure on the politicians who make decisions and holding them to account. Not an easy thing, but something that we've moved as a society generally away from, maybe out of cynicism, maybe out of taking it for granted. So there's an activism opportunity here that I'm referencing.
I'm going to jump in. This has been amazing. I feel like it needs to be a series, as many of our shows are. But we do have time constraints, and so we're going to have to wrap up this session. Thank you so much, Howard and Doron, for being here and getting this conversation more in the forefront of our thoughts. I want to remind some viewers, we actually had Noam Weissman on last time talking about the Open Door Media program. Howard talked with Lisa from Towson Hillel, and we've also talked about anti-Semitism before. So I recommend to everybody who's watching, you probably know if you haven't seen us live and in all the past shows, that you can find all of our shows by going either on the JMOR page, the Associated's Facebook page, or on YouTube. So you can view our past shows, and please spread the word. So again, thank you so much to Doron and Howard. And I want to remind our community about some upcoming dates and some ways they can be involved. On March 1st and 15th, the BJC is hosting virtual meetings with your Maryland delegates and state senators, and you'll have a chance to advocate in support of things like hate crime bills that have been introduced in Maryland. Also on March 8th, join the BJC for an anti-Semitism program with David Hirsch. Go to BALTJC, B-A-L-T-J-C, I believe is the correct site, .org, to learn more. And join us on the Upside next Tuesday at noon. We're going to be speaking with Emily Stern of J-Day Camps, Mary Rockland of Camp Airy, and Lisa Handelman of Capital Camps, because believe it or not, the time is here for us to talk about what camp will look like this summer. And in the meantime, please continue to visit associated.org and JMOR Living. There's always more information and stories and resources. You can sign up for our weekly newsletter. And again, thank you to our guests. Thank you to our viewers. And please, until we see you again, stay well.
Thank you, everybody.